Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So we are going to be extending this time the biome-based terrain generation. It's already done a bunch of extensions to it, adding in things like runtime generation, improving some of the modifiers, things like that. This time around I want to be focusing on the object placement side. And there's been a bunch of areas there where things people have requested for that. So I want to take a look at how we can accommodate those. So starting off, taking a look, the object placement, we've got our random and our Perlin noise ones, and they function largely the same. But one of the big things we have with them is they only support a single prefab. So that's something where it'd be nice if we could support multiple prefabs. It'd be nice if we could have a bit of a weighting there between the prefabs would also be great. So that's something that we're going to take a look at sorting out how we can do that. So what I would usually do for something like this is I would actually set up a class, so a placeable object config, and I would make that system.serializable. And then with this, well, it doesn't hurt to have a list of ones for the prefabs. But a common thing that could be useful is actually being able to give these a weighting. So being able to say how many of these particular ones we want to be able to spawn. So we're going to have weighting. And then what we will have for each one of our places is we're going to have a list of those. So a list of placeable object config objects. Now, part of the reason why I do things like put this in a config like that is just so that it means that it's a little bit easier for extending it if we want to at a later point. Now, we might also want these height limits, and whether it can be in the water or not, that could actually be a really useful thing to go into here. So I'm going to bring those into here. Now this is going to break a bunch of things. It's going to break things in our random and Perlin noise modifiers, and that's okay. A common thing when we're making changes, it can be really handy to actually just intentionally do breaking changes. So I'm deleting the prefab from both of the places, and so you've cleaned out a bunch of things, which is good. As in a very intentional thing, we wanted to make sure we have stuff where we're not sort of keeping, we wanted to have breaking changes in there so that we can easily work out bits that then need to be updated. Now, we were doing height filtering here, but that's not going to be valid to do the height filtering here anymore. So that means we still need the height, but what we will do is we're actually going to remove that from there because we need to do this a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is, just so I don't forget about it, put this here. So, okay, these have a weighting on them. So generally the first thing we often want to do is normalize the weightings. So that's a pretty standard thing that we would be doing. What I will also do then as a result is I'm going to make sure these call the base version. So just to make sure we've got literally all of the things in there. So we've got global config, we've got our object root, we've got the height map. I'm going to bring these down to another line. We have our height map scale, slope map, alpha map resolution. So many parameters to this. We have our biome map, and we'll also make sure biome index and biome are brought in. So we just want to make sure we do always call the base version to begin with. The reason is that now I actually want to do a little bit of logic here. So I won't actually have that run anymore because with this, I want to normalize these weightings. It's going to have a public float normalized weighting. Actually, and I can do this as just like that. So what we do to normalize the weightings is weighting sum is equal to 0, because we have to do this so that we get our proportions correct. So our weight sum is 0, so for each var config in objects, weight sum, we add in config.weighting. This allows us to, we don't need to make sure everything is perfectly balanced. It will just always rebalance and normalize the values. So really handy to do. We run effectively the same loop twice, except the difference is that config.normalized weighting is then config.weighting divided by weight sum. So that's good. So then random, well, what we want to do is it's gotten all of the locations. That hasn't had height filtering, anything like of that. We need to work out the number of ones to spawn, but that's going to depend on the weighting. So what I'm going to change here is for each var spawn config in objects, because that, and we just need to make sure that we have made that protected, because the child ones do need that. So we loop through all of these configs, and then this loop here is actually going to go within that, because we then, for each one of these, we do that spawning. And we would be checking here. So prefab is going to be spawn config. Well, it can have multiple prefabs. So we do a random range 0 to spawn config prefabs count. So pick a random prefab. Now the number to spawn, this actually we need to scale this by spawn config and the normalized weighting. So that I'm going to actually rough spawn count. Maybe base spawn count is a better term for it. So that way then, if we've said that a particular config, there should only be, a 20% weighting, we get our total number of positions, then we extract out 20% of those. So it means the proportions, this is the advantage of doing the normalized weighting like this and using it in this way, we guarantee we actually get the populations will fit those rough values pretty well. So that works out our spawn count. And the spawn count. Now this, we need to then do our height check, because we have these limits that we have to look at. So what we're going to need to do is our random location. We can let it pick that location. There's the location. If chosen, well, we need to then check here, spawn config can go in water. And checking our height limits here. So that's good. I'm going to reorganize that a little bit. Our height, well, that is spawn location.y. Now, these are a little bit tricky, because if we do a continue, then we'd end up with less to spawn. So what I'm going to do is can spawn is equal to true or is valid. So these will just set it to false. And this will set it to false, because then what we do is, well, if it is not valid, then we're going to do a continue, but before we do a continue, we do a minus minus index. So location is not valid. Now, it does mean if we get little bits of streaks with the randomness, it could pick the same one multiple times and skip it, which is undesirable, but that is a thing that could happen there. Finally, I want to actually move this instantiation logic here. So it's something we're doing a bunch. I'm going to move it into its own little standard function. So we'll have a protected void spawn. I'll make it virtual. Spawn object. So we'll definitely be given a prefab, and we'll definitely be given a spawn location. So that way, then this is the only place where it's doing that editor check. Just means that it's again a little bit cleaner, simplifies these places a little bit, which is good. We do always want to be mindful of code complexity. Simpler code is better, because simpler code means it's generally going to be shorter, it's easier to read, and means that we are less likely to run into issues with it. So that looks good. That gives us then, we have our spawn object function, spawn object, prefab, spawn location, and object root. So that looks solid. That will work for a pure random based one. Now, Perlin noise one is going to be a little bit more involved. Again, we remove the height limit check from here. That's going to again need to go down into here. We do again, though, get to change this to spawn object, prefab, spawn location, and object root. So I've simplified that a little bit. A lot of the logic here is going to be quite similar. So we will still be doing this same sort of setup. So we still have all of this logic. Because it's actually that, this loop here is probably going to be, I would say, identical, actually. So it's got the candidate locations. I think, because we've got the max spawn count, it is essentially the same thing. So what I could actually do is I could take all of this and I could put this in a common function. So protected, we'll move this here. Protected virtual void. Execute. I'm going to call it simple spawning because it kind of is. Like, it's not overly complicated. The logic that it's actually using for this, it is quite simple, the logic that it's using for this. So that was grabbing from the random one, and that was accessing stuff like the max spawn count, which that does mean, because we do have target density and max spawn count in both of those, I can move these into the parent class. So again, we're simplifying things, reducing the amount of similar and duplicated code, which is always good. These can go to being protected. Then we can start to, this will have a list of vector3 candidate locations. Probably doesn't need much more than that. It needs the procgen config. And I suspect it will need the object root. But beyond that, there's not likely to be much that it needs. No, there isn't. Because that means then this can do execute simple spawning. Give it the global config. We give it the object root, and we give it the candidate locations, because each one does use slightly different approach for generating the candidate locations. I'm just going to bring that down so it's a little bit cleaner. So the main thing that changes is actually how they generate those candidate locations. Beyond that, the rest of the logic is the same. We can get rid of that. Because where they change is the first one, the random, is just using this base one where what it does is it just gets every location that fits in the biome. So it ends up being a huge, huge, huge amount of stuff that we've actually got there. Whereas the Pearl and noise one, that one is actually using the noise scale with it. So it's going to give quite different results there. Okay, so let's test this out. It's going to break our object places a little bit. Some of the settings, like the density, stuff like that, will carry over, but we do need to reconfigure the objects. But that's okay, because we also can get rid of some of the modifiers. So it's a little bit simpler in that regard. So, all right, in terms of what we want to place there. So we're going to try and have it fairly similar to what the settings were before. So what I'm going to be able to do with that is I'm going to actually just compare against what settings I did have before and try and sort of recreate largely those same ones. So we'll say can go above water for this, and we will say it doesn't have height limit on it, and a target density, all of those are good. So we'll pick a prefab. So I'm going to have this spawn. We've got just some very, very simple ones. I think our basic food resource is good. Weighting wise, just makes sense as being 1. And actually I'm going to change that weighting so that we can just use a range for it. I think would be good. I'll default that to 1. And I'm going to have a range 0 to 1f. Just to make that interface for it a little bit nicer. Always better when you're working with those ranges to have sliders. So that's good. So we can place that. I'm also then going to chuck in another config where this, again, can only go above water. And this I'm going to say is the wood resource. But what I'm going to then do is adjust these weightings. So I want it to be, for the swampy area, very little in the way of wood in comparison to the food resource there. So that should work pretty good. So okay, at the 0.75 would work either way, but I usually want to try and have those 0 to 1. So that looks good. I'm going to copy that. If we do want to, actually I can just copy that field. So rainforest is going to, we'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. I'm going to use a Pearl and noise one, and I'm going to actually largely copy all of the settings from this to start. So copy component, paste values, but I want to flip these around. I want there to be very small amount of the food resource and a lot more of the trees. So it makes it very easy for getting that sort of variation. Grassy plains, I'm going to let be fully random. But then what I'm going to do is give this 2 ones. I'm going to copy the config for those and paste that in, but change it so that these are both basically an equal weighting. So we'll allow it to just use equal weighting for both. So that looks pretty good config-wise. Let's test that out. Let's see how that actually works. Important to always make sure we save beforehand, because obviously we can run into issues. So we're going to tell it to regenerate the world. Now we can see it is running in the background there because we set up our background task support. Those coroutines are going to need to take a little bit of time to finish. That's okay. We could also start to move some of the things into more of a coroutine. Now we did get an exception. That's probably going to be from us changing this. So that should be fine. Unless, let's just make sure if we missed configuring one of the sets of which I did miss the prefabs. That looks like it didn't actually copy them when I saved, possibly. It's lost all of the settings there for that, which have made that system.serializable. So it really shouldn't have lost all of these settings. Looks like it's just when I pasted those in, it didn't bring those across. So just something to watch for if you are copying and pasting settings there, that won't always work. Because it did change the values there, but it seems like it didn't properly persist. We'll make that resource wood. So neither of those can go in water, equal priority weighting there. Make sure that's saved, and this time we'll just double check that it has remembered and saved properly, which it has. So now we can run again to regenerate the world. See where it's at. So it's going to finish doing its logic. It does take a little bit. As I said, we could switch more stuff over to coroutines as a possibility there, especially those object places are doing quite a bit more now. So that's something where we may want to look at switching those over to being fully coroutine based themselves so that they're able to run a little bit more in the background. We can get some feedback on where they're at. You can see those coroutines are currently running because that's why it's pausing and taking a while at this stage. Okay, so it did actually get stuck in an infinite loop there, and the reason was, and this is something we need to watch for, we had stuff where it was set that it wasn't allowed to go in water, and it also wasn't allowed to go above water. So that's something where one of the things we're going to do right now is in this execute, where it's going through those different configs, I'm going to actually do a check, validate the configs. So for each of our config in objects, so f config, so if it can't go in water and config can't go above water, and I'm going to throw new system dot, I'm going to say invalid operation exception, I think is an appropriate one for this. So object placer forbids both in and out of water, cannot run. We'll throw an exception, that'll abandon all of the running for it, which will be good. Now we do have a bit of a risk with the logic here where it is possible that there may not be enough spawn locations there. So the we probably want to have a little bit of a safety net of the number of times that it can actually do a skip. So I'm going to check here, skip count is equal to 0. And then we update the skip count. And I will have a threshold here. Protected int max invalid location skips. So if it skips a location, get essentially 10 in a row. So otherwise, get to here, we'll set skip count to 0. But I want to check f skip count is greater than or equal to the max, just because we could get a case where every location is invalid. So if it keeps trying to, hammer picking invalid locations, that could get really bad. So what I will do in that case is if it has actually done that, then I want to just actually break out of this loop. So it's just going to skip spawning this particular set of objects, just as a safety net, because otherwise it could get into an infinite loop. And we could adjust skip count there as needed. So that's good. We've got our exception checking in there now. So let's run this again, because it should be a bit more robust, should be able to finish in a bit more of a reasonable time period, because we don't have those issues there. It's always something to watch for with procedural generation. It's why you'll notice I'm always really pedantic, or try to be really pedantic about saving, because it's very easy to run into issues there with it. So that looks not too bad. It's gone and placed a bunch of stuff. Now we definitely don't have as much being placed as we did before. So we do want to probably do some checks, make sure we've got some counts happening there of the number of things being spawned. Although we did lower the counts, so at most, and we'll check our different biomes, because only 1, 2, 3 of the biomes place objects. So at most, we should have like 750 objects, which we do have quite a few. We're going to log out once it actually finishes placing. We'll log out the number of things placed. So num placed is equal to 0. So we'll actually track this here. And we'll do plus num placed. And then once we hit this debug log, placed, num placed objects out of, we have the number 2 place, so we have num2 spawn. That's going to give us a sense of, is it managing to spawn the correct amounts? A thing that could cause it to potentially not be is if our skip count, if we've set that threshold too low, which is possible. We might need to allow a little bit more buffer there, but we'll let it run again. We'll see what we get in terms of what it reports back. Is it placing the full amount that it's supposed to? Because that's something where we do really want to make sure that it is properly spawning all of the things that it needs to. And we can see that's looking pretty good, actually. That looks like it's spawned everything. So it's just our thresholds at the moment. We've got fairly low thresholds for things being spawned. But that's great. So we've got spawning rules back in. We have the different spawners updated to be using this. We can now easily set for each spawner a range of different things that it can spawn, the different probabilities of those, and per each one actually configure the number of ones there. So that is going to give us a lot more control over the spawning of the objects, which is great. And we're still removing ones when we place something. So that means we've still got a bit more of a, we're not going to have ones that are overlapping. And now we can just use the one modifier, so we can reliably have it be the case that none of them are going to be overlapping, which is cool. Okay, so now that we've got the objects being placed, we want to actually start having the positioning of these a little bit varied. Because if you notice, with anything that we're placing, it's always actually in the exact same orientation. So that's something where what we're going to do is our spawn function here. We want to vary the position a little bit, vary the rotation a little bit. So because we've got our centralized spawn function, it's quite easy for us sorting out the rotation. To generate the rotation, so that's quite straightforward. So spawn rotation, and just use a quaternion Euler. We want nothing around the x, a random dot range from 0 to 360 for the y, and 0. That gives us our spawn rotation then. So we can throw that in. Now I don't know if instantiate prefab, if the prefab utility one actually has, lets you set the thing. Don't think it does, so that's okay. What we do then is just spawn game object, transform, and its rotation. Rotation is fine. We swap in that here. So that's good. That means we've got the positions there will be slightly rotated. So this will just introduce a little bit of rotation there on this. We can also introduce a slight sort of position delta as well. That's something where I would generally have a control here for max position jitter. So I'm going to say something pretty low. We don't want it to be very much at all, otherwise it's really easy to get stuff floating in the air without doing another raycast or something like that. Or even like 0.15, keep it fairly minimal. Because then what we would do here is vector 3 position offset is a new vector 3 to a random range, minus that to that. Y, we don't want any change in Y. And we do the same in Z. That looks good. And we can just add that to our spawn location. Just means that it will be, everything's going to be a little bit offset. It's random. Means that if you have really, the thing that this fixes is if you have really dense population of stuff, it's going to be a little bit more sort of spaced out. It's not going to be so perfectly aligned. So what I'm going to do is we can see stuff like the trees, the wood, things like of that. We've already got the locations for those. They will be aligned to a grid. It's just our grid is not a 1 meter one. But if we regenerate our terrain, these will shift around a little bit. It could take a little bit to regenerate it. So they'll shift around a bit. They'll be slightly offset of those grid points. So it means if you have something like a really dense forest, it's not going to look like everything is perfectly lined up, which is something that then immediately looks weird, exposes the fact that, yep, this is procedural generation happening and it tends to not look great. Now, although these don't have anything on them that is sort of changing, they are symmetrical, they do all have, if we look, different rotations, which is great. That's what we wanted. And what we can do is we can also, let's ramp up the density now. So I'm going to make it, we'll go from spawning 250 up to 1,000 in the swamp. And we're going to regenerate that. Should give us a lot more density, should mean that we have a lot more ones that are more closely clustered, which means we'll be more able to see things like the fact that it is properly sort of avoiding having them be too close to each other. And the amount of jitter, we set it low enough so that it shouldn't be able to jitter one object into another. Because that's an important thing as well. We don't want an object being able to be appearing in the middle of another one. And that's sort of part of the reason why having the thing centralized in the one placer. So that's good. We can see we are in the swamp area here. There's more density, and these are a lot closer, we can see there, than they would otherwise be. You can see that rotation. It's subtle, but there is a little bit of rotation difference there. So the positioning looks a lot better with those. And that's with the much higher density in the swamp. We could ramp up the density even higher across all of the ones. We just need to be mindful that that's going to result in it taking a lot longer for placing them. We can just double check again that it managed to place everything, and it did. Successfully placed all of the ones we were telling it to, which is great. So that's pretty good. We've got our improved object places that now have the different sort of setup there, so we can, with a single placer, have different objects, or different even sets of objects that it's placing with different weightings. Some of them can be in water, some of them don't need to be in water. So we've got that working sort of quite nicely, which is excellent. And we've got a few more error checks in there, so it'll catch infinite loops. And we've got a little bit of rotation and randomization on the positioning of things, so that they are going to be a little bit more broken up, looks a little bit more varied there, which is excellent. That's sort of what we're wanting to go for with it. So as always with this, dive in and experiment with it. See, with these changes, what sort of things you can add in now to your biomes. This should give a lot more options for being able to place things. There are going to be further updates that I will be making to this, so if there's things that you're keen to see, feel free to chuck suggestions in the comments. Always looking for further ways to be expanding and adding to things like this, because these are areas that I really enjoy working with and improving and extending. So yeah, any suggestions, feel free to chuck in the comments below. Thanks folks, I hope you found the video helpful and enjoyable. If you have, chuck an A, like and subscribe, really helps out, really appreciate it. If you're looking for the code for the project, there is a link to that in the description below. You can freely use the code for any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.